Three, two, one.
Good morning. I'd like to welcome you all to our presentation this morning as a part of the Petersheim Academic Expo, Peoples and Cultures of America. My name is Reverend Dr. Forrest Pritchett. I am the professor of that course at the university. The course is sponsored and offered through the Interdisciplinary Studies Department. Our course code is IDIS 1501 and 1502. In this course, which was developed by our faculty a number of years ago, we attempt to help us as Americans and as international students to understand America as that vast melting pot of many cultures and great heritage. But often in telling that narrative, we find that sometimes a lot of the details that are part of that pot of stew, so to speak, if we think about the mixing of many cultures, we're all blended together in terms of backgrounds, identities, ethnic heritage, geographical backgrounds. But as a part of that process, sometimes a lot of the detail is lost for the sake of presenting generalizations that tell that American story. But through our course, we are committed to covering as much detail as possible so that the subtleties of how does a land which is already occupied by millions of people, the indigenous tribal nations of North America, how do we go from having a land which was here for hundreds of years with all of those tribal empires, converting itself literally through colonization and perhaps exploitation? How do we then get the emergence of the American empire? And as we move perhaps that story from the 1500s through into the 21st century, what are the pieces of that story that help us to inform who we are as a people and where this nation is going, not only as a physical nation, but as a cultural nation, as a political nation? We still, in the 21st century, keep our arms, our minds, and our hearts open to all who wish to join us in this great American experience. But the reality is, so often our cultural baggage begins to influence what we are becoming. So in that context, I'd like to take a moment to at least present some thoughts on how we as cultures are blended together, and then from that, perhaps look at how ethnic identity begins to play out in the American experience. We will also take a moment to look at various factors which can cause any of us to develop our class position. Normally, occupational backgrounds help us to become who we are. But also, we find that specifically within America, some of that formula about who becomes an American and how far we can progress can influence that whole model of determination. When we look, for example, at our identities, it is important to realize that from the period of time when we first began to colonize this North American territory, which would start at approximately a few people coming to the latter part of the 1500s, more people coming into the Jamestown colony in the early 1600s. At that point, the colony, the Spanish colony at St. Augustine Florida was already in existence. The first English colony would be Jamestown in Jamestown, Virginia. Life was very difficult. As a matter of fact, those first inhabitants were met with some degree of, just as they came without announcing themselves, then the reception they received was not like you would understand through the story of the first American Thanksgiving. The reception they received what might be called difficult, or they were viewed as invaders, and consequently, they came under attack by the native population. This does not imply that the natives were hostile, nor were they savage. They were simply doing what was within their rights. Their territory was coming under invasion, and they responded the only way they knew how. So that Jamestown story is fascinating, and it is very different than the story that begins to emerge years later, when additional colonists began to move into the New England area. And so often with the movement into New England, that is where we begin to develop the stories behind the American narrative. The story of Thanksgiving, while it is seen as a rich tradition by many of us that celebrates that ability to survive with the cooperation of the local nations, of the indigenous people. And I might add, the indigenous populations actually never called themselves Indians. That is a term which comes out of the explorations of Columbus as he was searching for new trade routes to India. So we need to understand that it is perhaps more appropriate that we learn more about that native population. A native population that had a 1,000-year history, a native population that did have specific names, not one general pronoun, a nation with rich heritage. In many cases, they also had legacies of political development. They literally had forms of democracy, not as formalized in a sense with buildings and so forth as ours, but indeed, as we look at the Iroquois nation along the East Coast, for example, developed what was called the Iroquois League, which they had political representation. But we say all of that to help us all to fully perhaps appreciate something that most of us have very little knowledge of, that indeed there were, within the nation that was aspiring to be developed, there were over 500 indigenous nations already in existence. And the sad truth of the story is that in time, those nations fell, many of them, under the colonialist mentality of the United States. Many of those nations were decimated through military policy. Millions of people were displaced from their homelands, and the sacredness with which those indigenous nations considered this land. There were over 500 tribal nations here. 500. If we start to think about their backgrounds and their names, we could start at the top of an alphabetical list to identify names like the Apache, Comanche, the Cherokee, Navajo, Blackfoot, Lakota, the Sioux, and so forth. But imagine all of that history being eradicated by outside invaders in time. So this makes us appreciative of understanding all the stories that make up the American people. And when it comes to forming the American identity, how did that come into existence? Well, some of the first people who arrived at this land were from northwestern England, from the former the British Kingdom. Many social scientists today will grab three major characteristics of the first wave of immigrants that arrived to identify those characteristics. They were of a Caucasian background. They were represented Anglo-Saxon culture, and they were predominantly Protestant in background. So when we combine those three elements, we know that as other groups began to come to the country, the first groups that arrived, who had been here for hundreds of years, began to use the model of their cultural background to compare all other groups. Now, one thing that we are often not exposed to through our history books is the fact that the first culture that plants itself, after not appreciating the traditional and indigenous cultures that were already here, we began to use our new cultural model to then compare all other groups that were coming into this country from Europe, eventually Asia, Africa, South America, Central America. And the model that was going to be planted here for identity formation was also highly influenced by the fact that perhaps on the European continent, there was a high sense of what may be called ethnocentrism, which is to say, people from various regions had a unique pride in their particular region, their country, their nationality, their language structures, their religious structures. They had such pride to the point of favoring their backgrounds without fully appreciating the backgrounds of others. And as a matter of fact, in that lack of appreciation, we found that many of those cultures from other backgrounds found themselves systematically being treated differently in terms of how they were appreciated and how their cultures were valued or not valued in the process of them coming to this country and working through the process of becoming American. We can look at eventually the model of identities to say the following. Identity formation is not simply limited to the identity that we grow up with in our own households. Those might be called local and social types of factors. On a cultural level, which would involve the entire country and our history, many other factors begin to play into identity formation, such as your geographical background, your race, your socioeconomic status, gender, your sex, your sexual orientation, your language, your first language, any situation pertaining to your physical and mental abilities, your age, and your religious orientation. That's how this American model of who is the American begins to take shape. And we are proud, of the task that befalls us in the area of peoples and cultures of America, that we can learn how to peel away the various layers of time and of misconceptions and of deliberate distortions of that history. James Lowen, in his book, The Lies My Teacher Told Me, explains this phenomena this way, that indeed the story of the American narrative is so overgeneralized that we need to spend a lot of time perhaps correcting our lens of perception. We need to correct the things within that history that have been deliberate, not only distortions, but deliberately left out. That is why we see now in the 21st century such an emphasis on many people within the American culture, looking at, for example, the statues, which were developed in the context of the Confederate nations moving ahead with their set of values as a challenge to the overall nation's perspective of freedom and liberation for all people. Many people mistakenly presume, for example, that those Confederate statues were all placed up perhaps during the Civil War. The reality, it was many, many decades after the Civil War that the statues were put up as a way of honoring those heroes of the Southern Confederacy. As we now begin to move in the 21st century toward correcting those overgeneralizations from history, many Americans are now beginning to feel that indeed we should re-examine why those statues are up, what they represent. And if they're not going to be taken down, perhaps the least we should do is to amend the statues with plaques which describe, for example, the true essence of so-called heroes that are represented on those statues. Those statues were actually put up so long after the Confederacy. Many believe that they were put up as reminders to the recently emancipated slave population about really who was the boss in the South. So indeed, one piece of art, one piece of sculpture carries different meanings to different groups of people. For many other people, the presence of those statues simply convey, if you would, the idea that the Confederacy never died. It didn't die during the Civil War, but it is still very present and very active to the present. We also have a major consideration underway now for the total ramifications of what did it mean and what impact did it make when Columbus came to the New World. We have a story that most fifth graders can tell, but it is reduced to such the minimalist level that the true impact of Columbus's movement here is never really told. Most Americans just believe that Columbus made one trip. It was a happy voyage and everybody was proud of him after the voyage. The reality is Columbus made over 4 voyages. And during the second voyage, he brings back Spanish military. And by the third voyage, Spain is in the process of extracting gold from the indigenous population through the types of mining techniques that were appropriate in the Caribbean. And there were some severe penalties if Columbus and his entourage did not receive the weekly allotments they had placed upon the indigenous population, the Taino population in the Caribbean. If they did not receive a thimble of gold at the end of that work week, indeed, physical mutilation of those Tainos would occur. But that's not a part of how we tell that narrative. Well, we say all of this to paint a picture for what we're going to be experiencing during this session today. We also could talk about what I call the wheel of oppression, which is in the modern world, we look at the ways in which domination can represent itself, how some groups are elevated, others are not. And we often have our students to do work on these areas by reading materials which could help to gratify themselves in terms of things they would like to learn, but were never exposed to. So with that in mind, we have a number of students with us this morning who will share with you in their own way research that they have been involved with, or their involvement with activities which facilitate diversity and inclusion at the university. We have numerous classes which are available, such as Peoples and Cultures of America, in which we encourage the students through their selection of materials to dwell into issues that they would like to know more about. So in that context, we're going to have presentations today which will be looking at certain aspects of American culture from the point of view of the people that are involved. And then we're going to be finishing up with the presentation that will be looking at how one student or students at the university can be involved in various activities which facilitate diversity and inclusion. And as Seton Hall is one of our models, that we are a home for the mind, heart, and the spirit of everyone. And we love to encourage servant leadership. So one or two of those servant leaders will be with us today to explain their work. So we're going to start with, I'm going to ask each of the students who are going to present, when they start to present, to mention their name, their year at the university, their major, and their hometown. And then they'll go into the topic that they have either read about or have been active with. So with that in mind, I'm going to ask Marissa to now come forward and share with us her presentation. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Pritchett, for that nice introduction. I am Marissa Broderick, a junior here at Seton Hall, a social and behavior science major with the applied health track, and I am from Bayonne, New Jersey. So today I'm here to present to you my book presentation about Making Italian America. And this book focuses on consumer culture and the production of ethnic identities. The editor of this book was Simone Cinato, and he and 13 other authors wrote 14 short essays which compiled into one story to shape the identity of Italian Americans. So on my first slide here, I have just some general points that I grabbed from the book. So this book, although is 14 short essays, it is broken up into 3 different categories that shape and tell the story of an Italian American. So the 3 parts are self as alien, politics, and consumer styles and patterns. On the next point, it says Italian nation, consumption, taste, and lifestyle. And that statement was mentioned numerous times throughout the book. And Italians do pride themselves on these 3 aspects, and it's what shapes their tradition, style, things like that. So next I want to talk about, it's bolded in green on the slide, Italian immigrants to the US who are often studied as producers, not consumers. And I highlighted producers because this point struck me while reading the book, that even though Italians came over to America to consume the American dream and for better opportunities, they were also producers, as they brought over their traditions, their luxury goods, foods, and things like that for Americans to consume. So in the 20th century, nearly 3 million migrants from rural Italy came to America through Ellis Island. Peak years of migration were 1890 to 1915. And then in America today, we currently have 2 Little Italies, Mulberry Street in Manhattan and Belmont or Arthur Ave in the Bronx. And the last point, Casa Italiana at Columbia University, that was the first Italian academy in America, which was able to study the language of Italian as well as the culture and lifestyle. So next we have part 1 of the book, which is Immigrants Encounter and Remake U.S. Consumer Society. So the first person, I have some important people here from part 1. Mr. Marconi was the inventor of long-distance radio transmission or wireless telegraphy. And this was an important turning point for Italians because they were able to communicate from those still in Italy to those in America and vice versa. So they were able to start making Italian cable channels, Italian radio stations, and things like that to communicate with one another. And I want to jump to the production aspect of part 1, where I talks about assembly line procedures and the life of a worker. So on the bottom of the slide, I have a quote: "The American student goes to school like the worker goes to the workshop, to learn a trade, not to educate himself." And I found this interesting because the book also mentioned that a 1911 article in an Italian-American newspaper stated, in quotes, "The shame of America is the university." And I found this interesting because it kind of challenges our views versus Italian views. Nowadays, as people of America, we go through higher levels of education, such as colleges or doctorate degrees or master degrees, to earn a job. But in Italy, they more pride themselves on their work and learning a trade that they could pass on to generations and generations. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about travel and women that was mentioned in part 1. So picture here on my slide is people waiting in line to be tested after coming off a boat from Italy at Ellis Island. So in 1892, the first boat arrived at Ellis Island, which was the only and mandatory admission station point for those coming to America. All boat passengers were required and submitted to medical inspections and mental tests, determining which immigrants were deemed worthy to go through the Golden Door. And the Golden Door is in quotes because that was like the key aspect or the main end goal for those coming over, because once they were through the Golden Door, they were able to divulge in unlimited possibilities and opportunities. And actually in 2006, Emanuele Crelesi published and released a movie called Novo Mondo, and that in Italian is Golden Door. So there was a film made about this journey for those coming to America. And also, going back to the picture on the slide, Augustus F. Sherman, who was mentioned in the book, was the chief clerk at Ellis Island, as well as an amateur photographer. So while working at Ellis Island, he was able to take pictures such as this one, as well as many others, to capture these moments in history and be able to write about them years later. And in my next part, under women, I want to draw everyone's attention to the last bullet point, which gives some statistics, such as in 1925, 64% of all Italian women worked in the fashion industry, while another 21% worked in other factories. So this kind of also struck me as how the divide in types of work or labor, where the women were consumed in making clothing and fashion pieces and things like that, while the man was learning a trade to be able to pass down to future generations or family members. This next slide brings us to part 2 of the book, and part 2 was the politics and style of Italian-American consumerism. So with that, talked a lot about how Italian-Americans' end goal was what they thought achieving the American dream was purchasing their own home in America after coming from Italy. So the second point here, the NIRA Act in 1933 was able to federally regulate maximum hours of work as well as minimum wages. And now that minimum wages were created, those working were able to earn a steady pay and increased purchasing power of those in America. And also the Federal Housing Administration in 1934, which was established, helped numerous Italian Americans fulfill their dream of acquiring homes, which I mentioned. Also, 2 other bills that the book did briefly mention was in 1937, the Wagner-Steagall Act, also known as the Housing Act, which was able to regulate purchasing homes as well as financial opportunities, and also the homeowners refinancing bill, which was signed during FDR's New Deal during the Great Depression, which helped those who were on the verge of losing their homes. And the last point on my slide, which mentions the Depression, even though in the 1920s, a lot of Italian American families started marching out of these tenement houses, which did not provide the best living conditions, the Depression did halt that achievement of progression and kind of had to forced some families who moved out of tenements to move back due to low income and the Depression. Next, on part 2, it also got into modern aspects and as well as the entertainment industry, such as music, film, TV, and things like that. So the top 2 pictures of Frank Sinatra, Jerry Valli, and Tony Bennett, those were 3 of the most prominent Italian-American musicians who entertained those through their music, and it gave a new culture to Italian music, which combined with Americans. Also, a not pictured but I have mentioned on the slide is Congressman Vito Marcantonio, and the book mentioned him variously when talking about housing, especially because he was a major spokesperson for Italian Americans, especially for better housing prices and conditions for these people. And then also I have on the bottom of the slide that in 1970s, the term or concept for Italians was created called, in quotes, Guido, and that kind of described their lifestyle and their traditions, as well as how their everyday dress goes, and things like that they do during their daily activities. And 2 shows which I was surprised that the book talked about it, but getting into the modern aspect of how Italian Americans are portrayed, there are 2 TV shows that currently run, which the book talks about, which is Jersey Shore and The Real Housewives of New Jersey. And they mention these books, these TV shows, because they believe that this is a slightly over-exaggerated portrayal of the Guido term or Guido concept. Also, not on my slide, but I wanted to make a point to address was Christopher Columbus, who in October 12, 1492, he discovered America, came to America, and this year it will be exactly 528 years since that happened. But something I noticed was, even though this holiday, Columbus Day in early October, is celebrated mostly by Italian Americans, there is new information coming about that Christopher Columbus is not actually Italian, more rather than Spanish, which is interesting because for many years Italians have prided themselves on this accomplishment and holiday, but there's turning of information on this. So in part 3, this talks about the consuming, and so consuming Italian American identities in the multicultural age. So some Italian American examples in modern day world. So as you see here on my slide, I have a couple pictures of big Italian companies who have made their way to America and have succeeded in selling their products, so such as Gucci and the sneaker company Golden Goose. And then some information I talk about in the slide is that in the 1980s, in quotes, made in Italy luxury goods, it created the Italian economy to become successful or even boom due to these goods. And many Italian luxury companies are still booming in today's economy due to their popularity. In 1926, and it still goes on to this day, the yearly Feast of San Gennaro happens on Mulberry Street. And I think that this is something important to the Italian culture today because it celebrates their culture as Italian Americans, as well as the feast of this saint from their people. And then also the last point, part 3 also got into the sports of Italian Americans. And when reading, it talked mostly about basketball because a lot of Italian Americans are involved in basketball, especially college basketball. So in the 1980s, 6 Big East teams reached the NCAA Final Four, and 4 of these 6 were coached by Italian Americans. So Villanova, Providence, St. John's, and of course Seton Hall was coached by P.J. Carlesimo. And then the book also mentioned how, going back to the entertainment and film, in 2005, HBO released a documentary titled The Perfect Upset, the 1985 Villanova versus Georgetown NCAA Championship. So with these Italian Americans prominent in college basketball, they were also exposed to film and the entertainment industry to tell a story about their journey in the NCAA tournament. And then next, the picture on the slide is Little Italy on Mulberry Street. And here I wanted to talk about population changes, because at the end of part 3, it heavily talked about population changes. So in 1960 to 1980, the Italian ancestry population on Mulberry Street specifically declined by half. So 39.8% to 17.1%. So we were almost at 50% Italian population in that area, but it declined heavily. So also in 2000, only 7.8% of the population on Mulberry Street was Italian ancestry. So we see 20 years later, the population still declining. And in the early 1970s, that marked the low point of population for Mulberry Street. So although a major decline on Mulberry Street in the late 1900s, since 2000 to 2010, there has been a jump in popular restaurants and signature Italian food, which has brought back foot traffic as well as popularity to the area. So also what I wanted to point out was some articles that were mentioned in this population section of the book. In 1975, a New York Times article declared Mulberry Street as in quotes, a graveyard. So with people writing articles about this, we see how others noticed the heavily decline in population, but now there has been a revamp or remake of the area to bring back more foot traffic. So in conclusion, to wrap up my presentation, I have a couple points I want to talk about, such as impact and significance for IDIS. So this story of Italian Americans, although was divided up into 14 parts covering essentials such as food, lifestyle, traditions, work, architecture, things like that. Even though it was 14 different parts, it came to one, but also these 14 different parts were able to break down the ideal image of an Italian American for us readers to piece together all important aspects or components of an Italian American life to be able to get a better sense of what life was like. But also significance was that even though there was a lot of information given about those coming from Italy to America and how they divulged into new culture and customs, Americans were also able to absorb some new things that Italians were able to offer to them. So there was a mix of two cultures coming together to create the ideal Italian American. After reading my book and doing some analyzing, there was 3 critical questions I came up with. So something I thought of today, which would be interesting to research after reading the segment about the population on Mulberry Street, is where are some of the most highly populated Italian American cities of the United States currently today in 2020. Next, since the book was edited and published in 2014, have there been any major changes to modern day information that was presented, such as food, shows, or maybe clothing? And lastly, the book focuses a lot on the lives of those who came over from Italy to the United States, but how about the children of those people? How are their experiences different or better, or what do they get to experience that their parents didn't, or what do their parents get to experience that they are unable to? And then just briefly, I talked about the impact on America and Italy. So from this book and learning how America shaped Italians, America also shaped Italy, as I spoke about before. Italy was able to benefit from trade and learn from the American economy while also producing luxury goods, which I spoke about, to boom production as well as profit. And Italians were able to bring their traditions and customs into America while also accepting what America had to offer to blend and create. And that is all for my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marissa. I believe next we have Emilio Soto.
Yeah.
who
Can
will
you guys
follow-
hear me?
Yes, we can. And
Okay.
we're going to have Emilio tell us about his background and also his work with looking into various social movements which have helped to transform America. Emilio, the mic is yours.
Yes. Hello, my name is Emilio Soto, and I'm currently a senior at Seton Hall, and my hometown is actually Patterson. I'm from Patterson, and today I will be presenting the book I was recently assigned, and it is called When We Fight, We Win. And just the title of the book alone just caught my attention, because when you think about fighting for something, there's power. There's power when you fight, and there's power when you stand up for something that you believe in. And just the title alone caught my attention. And now we can go to the next slide. So yeah, I'm going to give you a background on the author, and the author's name is Greg Jobin Leeds, and he is the co-chair for the Schott Foundation for Public Education. He also became the president of this foundation, and he pursued a career launching, nurturing, and encouraging high-influencing social change organizations. And in his writing, it is evident that he is passionate about social change, and in this specific book, he talks about the power of uniting to pursue a desired goal or outcome. And as I said before, there's power. There's power when you unite, and when you have common goals with people around you, and you work together, there's power in that, So next slide. Now I'm going to give you an overview of what this book is about. So this book starts off by explaining the different social movements that have emerged in the United States through the late 20th century to the present and what they are fighting for. Unjust policies have given rise to these social movements. And this book proposes that when a community of people come together to fight a common cause, there's an incredible power that is manifested. It's when people come together that there is a power that to be able to fight and win victories, whether it's for social equality, education, and more causes. Next slide. And now I'm going to get into some key issues that were mentioned in the book. And I found this pretty interesting because there's quite a few of them. And some of the ones that I came across, the first one was discrimination against sexuality and gender identity. The second one was marriage equality. The third one is actually educational policies, no child left behind, underfunded schools. The fourth one was very interesting to me as well. This one was mass incarceration of colored people, and I put in parentheses New Jim Crow. That was the term that they used, and I found it really interesting that was like a label that they put for for mass incarceration of colored people. It was new to me, it was new to me, and in a way it's kind of in a way like the author kind of explains how basically that this was kind of like a mask for what racism what racism actually was, during this time. And it was kind of like it was basically like a disguise. They didn't want to call it racism, but this was the term that they used, to kind of disguise it. And then you have the school to prison pipeline. And you also have immigration rights as well. And this actually, it talks about the Dreamers and their fight for to obtain, you know, DACA, and also it also mentions about the Dream Act, and also their economic policies as well. So this is basically, you know, capitalism as a mask for racism. And the last one was environmental issues, you know, preserving the environment and using less resources that are that can be more harmful, you know, to the ecosystem, to the environment, because what happens is that um we do actually more harm than good when we use resources, you know, from the environment, and not realizing the potential harm that it can do to, you know, for example, the animals, the potential harm it can do to, you know, just everything, you know, around us. Next slide. And now I'm actually going to get to the social movements that were fighting for justice. And the first one was the LGBTQ task force, and Southerners from New Ground. And both of these were actually working together to fight against to obtain rights and wholeness, as the book describes. The second two movements were the Chicago Teachers Union. The Chicago Teachers Union, and also the Caucus of Rank and File Educators, which is CORE. The third one is National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is another well-known organization, and also hashtag Black Lives Matter. The fourth one is the Dreamers. And then the fifth one is Occupy, and the last one is Los Angeles Bus Riders Union. Yeah, next slide. Okay. And here are actually some events that were kind of highlighted within this book. And the first one was the Stonewall riots. This actually happened in 1969. I believe it was June, I think. And basically, with this event, the LGBT movement, they were fighting against the police raid for equal rights. And basically this actually gets into the whole idea where I was talking about wholeness. And at this time, the LGBT task force, you know, they were actually fighting, you know, for just you know, they were fighting so that they can feel part of society. You know, they were fighting to make their lives better as people, and their lives, you know, to feel more a part of society. And I think that was one of the issues, that they were feeling left out of society. They weren't feeling part of it, and they wanted to feel the freedom. They wanted to feel the freedom to be part of society without anyone, you know, without feeling judged, without feeling, you know, like they're different from everyone, you know, and they just wanted to feel at home, you know. And that's something that they were fighting for. And also they were also fighting for marriage equality. And what happened at this time was that they were actually presenting this to, you know, the Congress and government, and they've been denied so many times, but they still haven't given up. And recently, you know, I would say I think it was 2015, or that gay marriage was legalized, I think. And that was a victory that worked in favor for them after a long fight against the government. And now next we have the Chicago Teachers Union strike that happened in 2012. And basically, teachers at this time, they were fighting for better working conditions. There was the mayor of Chicago, actually, he was actually like a roadblock. He was actually a roadblock in this whole picture, because he didn't have any motivation to improve public schools. And all these schools, they were closing. They were, you know, there was excessive testing. There was so much going on, and it just affected the whole, you know, public school system, because there was no push. There was no they were underfunded, and it wasn't fair to the students. It wasn't fair to the teachers, and it was just a whole mess. And that's when the Chicago Teachers Union actually was established, when there was a need to fight for better working conditions. And that also leads also to Maestro Combativa that happened in 2008 as well. This was another strike that happened before the Chicago teachers strike, but it was pretty much the same. They were fighting for the same, just the rights, for better working conditions. And then you have Occupy Wall Street, and this actually is how the Occupy Wall Street movement formed. People were gathering at Zuccotti Park to fight the top 1%. And next you have another event that happened in 2012 called the Undocubus. And basically it was a bus ride from Arizona to North Carolina to raise awareness of anti-immigration policies. And next you also have a case that was in 2012, Miller versus Alabama, which was the U.S. Supreme Court ruling for mandatory life sentences without parole being unconstitutional. Next. Areas of summation. There were three areas. The first one was, significant of this book for IDIS analysis, critical questions, and impact on America and our knowledge of the groups mentioned. Next slide. So this is the significance for IDIS analysis. The first one is that it raises awareness of social issues that have been occurring in the US for a long time. The second one is issues are a reflection of stereotypes, biases, racism, and other ideologies that affect how people are viewed, how they are perceived, and the overall interaction between different groups of people. And the third one is that it gives enlightenment on the lives of African Americans, Hispanics, teachers, immigrants, and their struggles for justice in the United States. The fourth one is when people come together with a common goal in mind, there's more power and motivation to pursue a desired goal. And last one is when people come together, the main thing is that it encourages perseverance. And next slide. My critical questions, I actually had more. I think I had more written down, but these are like the ones that stood out to me and that I wanted to put in this PowerPoint. And these are my questions. Who is privileged? What makes a person or race privileged? Why is the government underfunding schools? Isn't education a right everyone should have? Why is education undervalued? What has sparked this idea of new Jim Crow? What are the grounds that dreamers can't make lives for themselves in the United States? Do dreamers have rights? And the last one is, why are we not acknowledging that resources we are using are doing more harm than good? And for the last one, is how does it impact, America and our knowledge of these groups? And these issues have had a great impact on how Americans view themselves compared to other people around them. In an average American's mind, they may think that they are not as privileged compared to other people, depending on what they see or hear or how they are treated. Status quo, stereotypes, racism, sexism, and other issues have created false perceptions of people, and it's still doing harm to this day. It's brought fear against people, prejudice, and more. Change is definitely essential to correct these views and correct the errors of the past. And that concludes my presentation.
We want to thank you very much, Emilio, for that very detailed analysis. We are now going to ask Demetria to prepare her material and to come forward with her presentation.
Yes, I'm posting one right now.
Thank you. Hopefully, we'll be able to also respond to some of the questions that are coming in at the conclusion of this next presentation. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Demetria Marshall. I'm a marketing major here at Seton Hall, and my hometown is Englewood, New Jersey. So I'm going to give us a rundown of the Inclusion Alliance. This is my second year serving as a peer leader in the Alliance. Our group facilitates discussion amongst freshman students within the university's U-Life classes surrounding the subjects of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what led me to this role and what drives me to grow within it, it is my genuine appreciation for
Demetria, you muted your microphone. Can you unmute it, please?
I'm sorry. What was my last point? I'm sorry. Did I cut out a long time ago?
You were just about starting up, I believe.
Oh, so you didn't hear any of it?
You might as well just start from the beginning, I believe.
Okay,
Thank you.
I'm sorry about that. Okay, so I'll start from the top. So again, this is my second year serving as a peer leader within the Inclusion Alliance. Our group facilitates discussion amongst freshman students within the University U-Life classes surrounding the subjects of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, what led me to this role and what drives me to grow within it is my genuine appreciation for uncomfortable conversation. Within my personal relationships, talks around the subjects of social justice and the like, they were no stranger to me. But I had to consider the alarming fact that there are people who have never engaged in these topics. So once the university pursued this initiative, I thought to myself, I could apply this passion within the classroom so I could pilot actual change around the ways we speak around these subjects. I was pleased to know that with the second session of this program, we were expanding conversation, whereas the first session of these U-Life courses were focused on the subject of diversity alone. But with the help of the Alliance's amazing training, the conversations and the connections that built between myself and the fellow peer leaders of this Alliance, I became well equipped to delve deeper into more complex topics such as prejudice, discrimination, racism. Looking back to the ways I'd prepare for my lessons, this year's material, it forced me to be more introspective, to form a strong personal understanding surrounding these subjects. In my personal experience, the delivery of the program content, it relies heavily on authenticity. And before I could look in the eyes of my peers and explain anything, I had to dig deep into my own. Now, each session was an enjoyable learning experience for myself and the students I had the pleasure to interact with. And I'm proud to have had the ability to encourage the freshmen to engage in these conversations. Just thinking back to looking at the different groups I'd divide up, and perhaps I would prompt a question to talk amongst themselves how their own identity has created certain issues in their own lives. And one by one, students would muster up the strength to talk with each other. And as the discussion would play out throughout the class sessions, people were more engaged, and the mere energy that was in the room, it was amazing. I just had to insert that. Now, I had more freshmen who came up to me in this semester compared to the last, asking about this group, commenting on how they could and how they too could be involved in the initiative. In return, their interaction is served as a further learning experience for me. And for the future of the Alliance, I want to see this conversation applied to the classrooms of upperclassmen, because every class of Seton Hall students can benefit from this, especially as we embrace the growing diversity on our campus. I would love to see the layers of this conversation grow and intensify, but because we can only gain more and change with more transparency and understanding amongst one another. Our society is becoming more globalized by the day, and our path to understanding amongst ourselves, it depends on the quality and the intimacy of the conversations we have And I'm excited to see what's going to come in my third year going onward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Demetria. So I believe I have at least one major question that I'll be responding to. That was very extensive understanding of the Native America population. And I might add that for those who perhaps were not here any earlier, to recap my initial point, the land that came to be occupied by all of those who were being sent over here on behalf of the interest of Britain. We called it America eventually, but when my students used the name Indians and then Native Americans, it's a fascinating history. It takes a lot more in-depth study. As I indicated, the indigenous populations never called themselves as such Indians. They had other local names. In many cases, even their names were, in a sense, names which were not given to them from the time they started here. Sometimes it was actually names that other groups who were here projected onto those native groups based upon certain characteristics, which all goes to say that in life, sometimes many of us have been named and labeled by other people. So we need to understand that. So often my comment is when it comes to identifying this larger group of inhabitants who are already here, I like to use the phrase the indigenous nations of North America as a way of identifying the entire collective with all of its heterogeneity or its differences that it represented. In many cases, they were not totally interconnected with communications with each other in all cases, but indeed did have distinctive, if you would, legacies and characteristics. So in that context, one of the questions that was emerged was, how can we bring about the infusion of more information along these lines? Well, actually, probably one or two courses do exist at the university for students, but it's not every student who is going to be motivated to want to learn all of this comprehensive history. I know initiatives have been undertaken within the last 2 years to provide for faculty who would volunteer to take part in the seminars to diversify the content of their courses. So obviously information on the native populations would probably fall in the purview of the social sciences, history, and anthropology. So that someone would need to be motivated within the context of their major requirements to see to it that they could take this material. We could also, as faculty, provide students with other opportunities for independent study along these areas. I would probably also mention that there is no aspect of American culture that is not touched by this this question of the ethnic backgrounds of all Americans. I know so often colleagues who are in the sciences don't see the relevancy of taking time beyond their scientific material in the area of natural and physical sciences to talk about these topics. But the reality is, ultimately, the sciences, when you look at the emergence of this nation and its ideologies and values, the sciences were used to lay the foundation for, very unfortunately, what we could call scientific racism. So that indeed there is room for all of us from the natural sciences, physical sciences, social sciences, and the humanities to take a look at all of these various issues. I would like to probably close out by also indicating other areas in which we could develop and identify topics which would be very germane to the study of American culture and all of the peoples and the cultures that have emerged consequent to that experience. It's not just about race and culture, but We do know now in the 21st century that one of the hardest discussions there is to have in America is about race and I would say in cultures. We all presume that the culture of the first groups coming here is the cultural model. They think it's a fine model, but the reality is many groups who came earlier decided to and they were almost forced to abandon their cultural backgrounds, abandon their traditions for the sake of becoming Americans. We can now see through the latter part of the 20th century and into the 21st century that more groups who are coming here with very long cultural traditions in their own countries want to hold on to their cultural backgrounds, hold on to parts of their language structures, hold on to their values, hold on to their attitudes of loving each other, loving family, and loving their neighbors. So that's one of the major shifts that we can see. But other topics would present themselves beyond the issue of perhaps race. For example, the assimilation process. How do we all become Americans? How do we assimilate to this land? Looking at power relationships. Who has the power to effect change in this country? Who has the power to determine your social status in life? Who has the power to determine what your identity formations are going to be? To look at the role of labor unions. My God, labor unions were used as they were literally forced into the American discussion of wages and occupational accessibility. Many European groups needed to develop the unions, despite the fact that those who owned the mechanisms for the economy actually fought tooth and nail to stop the labor movement in this country. And now we can look at in the 21st century how many state governments, as they become more fiscally conservative, are looking at, in a sense, taking away the power and the continuity of all of the benefits derived, for example, in the area of public servants, public service unions such as police, firemen, teachers, and all of those workers who support state governments, as decision after decision are being rendered by the courts of this land, indicating that if you work at a certain job, you cannot be compelled, and that's the case, to join a labor union. But those, without those labor unions, many Americans would have never been able to have decent incomes and ultimately save money to buy homes. We can look at another issue, the criminalization of certain populations. It is documented by many scholars, for example, that as soon as many Negroes were set free from the plantation system, that even a new kind of Jim Crow began to emerge in this country, in which the Negro male particularly is criminalized and is just so caught up in the American prison system to the point where many people begin to think that, black men are bad people. Reality is cultural mechanisms which were put into place during the earlier part of the 19th century have found their way into the 20th centuries and are still playing out in the 21st century. We can look at agricultural systems, things we take for granted. How does the food get to our plate every day? What is the mechanism by which lettuce, which may be grown in California, gets all the way across the country into the East Coast? And now, under the circumstances of the pandemic, agricultural production is not something that we can even take for granted. There is no area of American life which is not touched by this pandemic. We might look at issues of eugenics, where science indeed attempts to determine if there are better races when compared to each other. And the reality is, God only made one race, the human race. Below our skin coloring, every human body is constructed and composed of the same types of materials. We look at how children are socialized in this country. We can look at controversial issues such as affirmative action laws. Many people would automatically, when they hear that term, begin to think that affirmative action only benefits one group of people, which would be the African Americans. The reality is, since those laws were written and passed in the 1970s, 80% of the cases using affirmative actions in the US courts have been around the issue of sex, and is in gender and workplace discrimination. So these are ways in which we can pull away the layers of understanding the American experience. We tend to go through life and take so much for granted. But I think during this period of the pandemic, as many of us can sit sequestered and sheltered in place in our homes, we can reflect upon what it is to be in America today, and if we are living the best life that we possibly can, and what the future may hold. With that in mind, I want to thank all of our presenters today for being a part of this. We want to thank all of our tech people for being so supportive of all of us moving into this virtual experience in this virtual space. And we call everyone's attention to our remaining events. This afternoon at 2 o'clock, we'll be taking another look at diversity from the point of view of students who have done research, once again, along the lines of peoples and cultures of America, and other students who will be looking at their involvement as servant leaders in the process of infusing in inclusion activities within the context of the university. So on behalf of the entire Peter Scheim Academic Expo Planning Committee, we want to thank you for your time this morning. If you have additional questions, please feel free to send me an email at forrest.pritchett@shu.edu, and I'd be more than happy to join in conversation with you as we all move together to help to make America not only a better place, but to make all of us as Americans better people. So thank you all, God bless, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you so much for your attendance this morning. Bye-bye.